Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce White. I'm a Issues Advisor for Food Security and Hunger here at CRS. And always like to talk with our universities, and very happy that I get the opportunity to talk with college ambassadors this year. On this first slide, this quotation was actually given to me in a form of a postcard when I was a Peace Corps volunteer over 20 years ago. And it's an interesting, provocative statement, but what I think it really talks about is that hunger is really not necessarily an act of God. Certainly there are disasters, natural disasters that occur over time, all the time actually. But in terms of kind of chronic hunger, they're more of a function of policies, governmental activities, governance, rather than things that are outside of our control. So today I'm going to kind of talk about basically 4 different types of things. One is really defined food security, and then talk about a little bit about the prevalence of it. And then talk a little bit about the United Nations Millennium Development Goal, the first one, and that deals with poverty and hunger. And then talk a little bit about the U.S. response to food security around the world. So first of all, we're going to talk about hunger. What is it? And we'll talk a little bit about what the UN definition is, what they call hidden hunger. That deals with micronutrients or vitamins and minerals. And then really what the CRS definition of hunger is. So the next slide is really dealing with well, here, I'll just read it. Hunger exists when a person's body lacks the required nutrients to grow and develop for a productive and active and healthy life. One of the things is that with hunger, you can't really measure it directly, but you do as you measure the effects, of course, with loss of weight and other types of things. So you'll see that UNICEF's definition talks about very specific things. Underweight nutrition. Undernutrition includes underweight for one's age, too short for one's age, thin, and then, of course, deficiencies in micronutrients, which would have different types of symptoms depending on the micronutrient. But these are all very measurable, and that's good because then you can find ways of tracking your progress and figuring out who's in need. In terms of the CRS definition of food security, I'll let you read it, but it's all people at all times have both the physical and economic access to sufficient food and water to meet their needs for a productive and healthy life today, and the good health to use this food properly without sacrificing future food security. So in terms of food security, it really is broken down into 3 components: access, availability, and utilization. And I'll start at the bottom of the slide with availability. Is it available? Is it in your area? Are farmers growing enough food? If you're a farmer, are you growing enough food? Is it in the stores nearby? Some people live in very rural areas. And then going up to your left, access. Do you have money? If it's in the store and you don't have any money, you still don't have access to the food or other types of things. And then, of course, the utilization. In the household, sometimes people will cook food, and so that it would lose some of its nutritional values. Or within the household, is it utilized properly so that the right people are getting the proper food? There's some places that actually the people who need the food the most in the households, meaning the children, sometimes are the last to eat, perhaps, or do not have the most access to food within the household. So we'll talk a little bit about the prevalence. Where do most hungry people live? The number of chronic hungry people in the world goes up and down per year, and people kind of rush to quote the latest number. Anyway, the current number is roughly over 900 million chronically hungry people. In this pie chart, it's interesting because I think that probably if I were to ask you, each of you, to kind of tell me where the most hungry people live, I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that you probably say in Africa. However, because of the large populations in South Asia in particular, actually the most people who are suffering from food insecurity are living in Asia. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the complexities of some of these numbers a little bit, but anyway, the most people live in Asia. Here's a map put out by World Food Program, the United Nations World Food Program. And it might be difficult to see, but basically you get to the dark red, and those are really the crisis areas where over 35% of the population is suffering from hunger. The red areas are areas of basically, I think, between 25 and 34%. So you'll look and you'll see that lots of sub-Saharan Africa is really red and dark red. So, I mean, there are lots of crisis countries there in terms of chronic hunger. In India and Bangladesh, they're red. They're not the dark red, but because of their high populations, that's why you have so many people who are suffering from malnutrition. I just hear just a kind of a couple interesting statistics I pulled out. One is that really about half of the people who are hungry live in kind of rural areas. They're growing very small on small plots of land. I've always said that your average farmer in sub-Saharan Africa is a woman who's never stepped foot in a bank, probably grows food on something that's about the size of an average garden in the United States, or maybe a large garden in the United States, has very little education, if any, and has really no resources, and the governments really have really very little to do with these people. So they have lots and lots of strikes against them. Second quote here is looking at Nigeria, which almost 30% of the people who are living on less than $1 a day in sub-Saharan Africa live in Nigeria. One thing that really strikes me about this slide is that, we're talking about something that's very discouraging. You're talking about huge prevalence of hunger. 900 million people is roughly the 3 times the population of the United States. So we're talking about lots and lots of people who are suffering from hunger around the world. This is interesting because look, if you just address hunger in these 10 countries, you could tackle 73% of almost 75% of the hunger around the world. And look, the first column here is really dealing with the percentage of hungry children or underweight children in these countries. So that's the percentage. And you'll see that there are some of these, like India's almost 50% of the children are underweight. Bangladesh, almost 50%. Pakistan, almost 40%. So very high numbers. Of course, it goes down. But the middle column is very interesting. That's the percentage of the world's hungry children. So you look at India, and almost 40% of the children in the world who are underweight live in India. And then the other countries drop way below that. So that's why India is such a big, such an important country for this. And one of the things that's very interesting is that when we talk about India in the news, often we're talking about this kind of emerging economic powerhouse, huge middle class, lots of things going on. And yet, in spite of all that, there's a huge, huge problem of hunger in India as well. here's another way of looking at it. Here's mapping Asia, and you'll see basically the darkest colors are the ones that are having the higher children per square kilometer. So really highly concentrated. In Africa, you can also look, and one of the things I wanted to use these two slides for is to really show that through mapping, I mean, we kind of know where the people who are chronically food insecure live, and that's one important component to really fighting hunger. Hunger is, when you're talking about chronic hunger, people don't necessarily die of, they don't starve to death per se. They usually get picked off by diseases that aren't really a big problem for the rest of us. You can look around the different types of things that can kill hungry children, mostly. For instance, measles, that's something that we all either are vaccinated against or have had when we were children. But in some places, when your body is weakened, you can die from that. Malaria is, the malaria kills the weak mostly, and other types of things. ARI, I think it's acute respiratory illness. Then there's what they call hidden hunger, which are micronutrient deficiencies, things that we take completely for granted. Of course, our salt is iodized in our country, and so we don't even think about iodine deficiencies. But in many countries, there are no what they call fortification programs. Salt in this country is iodized because of law. It was, I think, during the 1930s where we started to fortify different things like flour and salt and other types of things. So there are actually organizations that work quite a bit with national governments to try to find fortification programs. But for those who don't have iodine, it can be a huge, huge problem. Vitamin A is another one. If children don't have enough vitamin A, it can, of course, lead to blindness and other types of really terrible things. Here's just a couple statistics I pulled. 40 to 60% of young children in developing countries suffer from iron deficiency, rather. And then 43 million babies are born with inadequate protection from mental impairment caused by iodine deficiency. So these are huge problems and things that in some ways are pretty easily solved in terms of we know what to do. We know what needs to be done. So I'm going to move on to MDG 1. This is the United Nations Millennium Development Goal, first Millennium Development Goal. And I'll talk about it kind of in detail in a minute, but it was during 1990, the Rome World Food Summit, that the world got together and decided that they really needed to kind of track progress on different development goals. And the first one, of course, is what some of us think are the kind of the most ultimate human rights, which are to have enough to eat and to have enough money to live. So the first Millennium Development Goal is broken down into two halves. Part A is really to cut in half the people in the world who live under $1 a day. And what's interesting about this is you look at the progress indicators, that these are all measurable, and they are measured. You can look at World Bank literature and other organizational literature, and you can actually track how a particular country is doing at any given year on these different indicators that deal with poverty. Part B is really the one that deals with hunger, and again, it's measured by prevalence of underweight children, under 5, and then proportion of the population below the minimum dietary energy consumption. So these are measurable indicators, and And I think that whether we globally, if we meet the first Millennium Development Goal or not, it's got everybody kind of looking at this issue around the world, and actually each country is then tracked, and I think that's a very, very valuable kind of phenomenon that's going on. So, in terms of success stories, I could give you more, but certainly there have been really huge improvements in different countries. You can look at Chile, cutting its hunger rate from 37% down to, under 3%. Thailand, 36% to 13%. Brazil is really in, a lot of people are looking at Brazil these days because they've really done some really amazing kind of programs in terms of fighting hunger and poverty, and are getting great results. Look at this, a 67% decrease in hunger just from 1970 to 2000. And of course, India, even if it's got such huge problems, it has made very significant progress over the years. The next two slides are going to really talking about kind of tracking how hunger has been going. We'll see right now that yes, the number of people has actually dropped a little bit from 2009. What happened was during the last food price crisis during 2008, the prices got higher. Fewer people could actually afford food, and it had all kind. It reverberated in all sorts of ways. So you had this huge spike, but now the number of hungry people is back down into the 900 millions. Now you look and you compare that to 1969, and we really have not made very much progress. As a matter of fact, it's worse now than it was back then. So there's lots of, it's a crisis that just is not going away. Here you have the proportion of undernourished people in developing countries. Now that is a steady decrease of the number of people who are actually suffering from hunger proportionally. Of course, the populations have grown in these countries, and therefore, even though you have more people who are suffering from hunger, actually the percentage of hungry people has actually gone down. So now we're down to, instead of up to over 30%, down to basically cutting that in half to about 16%. Hunger is a very complex issue, and it needs a complex set of solutions and interventions. I thought this was kind of a nice way to put this, is food insecurity can best be addressed by holistic and integrated programs that address food access, availability, and utilization. See those three components there at the individual, household, community, and institutional structural levels. So in terms of what needs to be done to achieve the first Millennium Development Goal, I wanted to talk a little bit about the U.S. approach to this. Historically, our approach to hunger around the world, this complex problem, has really been food aid. And CRS is as really good as any other organization and better than most in terms of programming food aid. So it's a very important part of our portfolio. But it's not the only component. And so one of the striking things is that historically the U.S. answer to this complex problem was this one instrument, food aid. and of course, it when you start thinking about really responding to a problem, you have 900 million people, and yet the office that programs food aid or oversees the food aid programs for the United States government says that we only reach about 50 to 70 million people per year. It's not solving the problem. We need a big, comprehensive approach. So actually, before the last presidential election, there was kind of a conversion of forces that were happening. One was on your left-hand side, you see that the world community was getting together. The G8 and the G20 groups were coming together and saying, this is a big problem. We have to really come together and do something about this. And then you have Congress and the administration. Congress was starting to float legislation to really deal with food security. There was a Food Security Act a couple of years ago that was really trying to pass in the Senate and the House. And then you had the Washington Hunger Community, which was basically, for a long time, really just advocated on food aid. But we were all coming together and saying, no, this is too complex of a problem just for food aid. And so we were all getting together. And as a result, the administration, the U.S. government, has started to respond. So they started to talk about a comprehensive approach to global hunger. Here's another way of looking at it. First, you have basically food aid. So when you talked about hunger for a long time, I used to always joke that I'd go to a meeting in Washington on hunger, and it usually took 5 minutes or less for it to become a food aid discussion. So here you're going in there talking about a problem, and you end up talking about a resource, and and it started to drive me crazy. Then, so what we're doing is we're talking about a more of a comprehensive approach. This is migrating toward really looking at multiple resources, not just food aid. And then, of course, the ultimate goal is to really look at addressing hunger in terms of problem solving, getting away from the resource and looking at what resources need to be applied to solving the problem. So how do we work in terms of trying to achieve the first Millennium Development Goal? So again, looking at being problem focused rather than resource focused. And of course, figuring out who's in need and where they live. You know, we're talking about these kind of mapping exercises, and you can kind of pinpoint where the hungry people are. And then looking at efforts that can really address their needs. And then finding ways to really scale those up so you can really reach a lot of people. And this is something that internally in CRS we're really talking a lot about. How do we scale up? How do we replicate good ideas? How do we scale them up in a cost-effective way to really reach a lot of folks? And then, of course, the goal is to moving these national indicators, these measurements of hunger on a national level. How do you do that? How do you get beyond that small community? So these are the things that we're grappling with, not only in CRS, but in the whole food security advocacy, but also the implementers as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the administration, the Obama administration, approached hunger after this kind of convergence of all these different forces. Basically, it's a comprehensive approach. They're looking at agricultural production, and when they talk about agriculture, improving agriculture, they're really talking about inclusiveness, making it so that not just the rich farmers get richer, but actually more people can actually improve their agricultural lives. Then nutrition. How do we get mostly children to have more nutritious diets? There are some studies that have been coming out lately that have been very startling, and they're really looking at focusing, because of these studies, focusing on really children in the womb from conception to 2 years of age. They call it the 1,000 days focus. And they say that if you can really give a child enough food, enough calories, and protein and micronutrients and a good nutritious diet up until 2 years of age, you have basically created a bright fate for that child. If those do not happen, the damage that can occur is unreversible. So I've been seeing lately, people have been doing brain scans of actually children with good nutrition under 2. children with good nutrition and children with poor nutrition. And you can actually see the images are different. People have been doing long-term studies in some countries and looking at children who have been malnourished under 2 years of age, and they track them throughout their lives. And they've been looking at seeing how those children go to school less, do worse in school, have poorer jobs, make less money, and it's a vicious cycle. And then it goes to the next generation and next generation and next generation. So there are efforts to actually try to break that cycle. Oh, I'm sorry. So then another component is this country-led approach, and the U.S. government is trying to reach out and develop partnerships with other countries, national governments, and other players in those countries to actually develop these partnerships. What happens is a country will say, well, this is what we would like to do, but we can only afford this much. And so then the other donors come in, maybe the United States and the European Union, the World Bank, UN organizations come in, and they say, okay, well, the World Bank will do this component, this slice of the pie, and the European Union will do this, and the U.S. government will do this. And often the U.S. government really deals with the private sector or nonprofit organizations and that side of things. We really don't necessarily donate directly to the actual governments, but the European Union does, and some other donors do that. And of course, how does CRS engage in that? What we do is we go and work in coalitions in Washington, D.C. We interact directly with the administration and Congress, and we scrutinize what they are doing and how these are going, and we interact with our field offices. And if we see problems, we voice them in Washington and elsewhere, and we try to develop a kind of a continued dialogue with policymakers in Washington to try to lend our hand in terms of trying to make these programs work. So there are a couple components to this Feed the Future initiative. One is they talk about sustainability. How do you work yourselves out of a job? I mean, CRS has been in some of these countries for decades, and we've been working with local partners, we're local church partners and other local entities. And so how do we help kind of build them up, help them build themselves up so that they don't really need this international organization? And we have worked ourselves out of a job in many countries, and we continue to do that. But anyway, that's one component of this, the administration's current approach to food security. Another thing is they're looking at value chains. What does that mean? That means, let's say, they think that a country can do a good job of growing corn, and a lot of people eat corn, perhaps. So what they do is they look at, well, do people have access to good seed? Do they know how to grow corn well? Do they have access to good fertilizer? Can they really improve their yields? Then when they grow the corn, is it going to rot in the field, or do they have good storage programs? After the storage, can they sell it? Is the market good? Are there enough roads? All these types of things. So that's what they call the value chain. And so the administration is working a lot on value chains for different countries, and they've chosen different ones in conjunction with the national government and other stakeholders. And then one of the things, this countrywide versus household economic diversity, one of the things that we're trying to push the administration with right now is this whole idea of, is the answer to, I'll just pick a country, Tanzania's hunger problems, do you just want to try to make sure that Tanzania has enough food in the macro sense? Or do you want to make sure that the people who are living under $1 a day are actually getting more food? The poorer parts of the population actually getting more food? So there's a tension between how do you make sure that or help a country grow enough food on this macro level, but you're not leaving people out as well in the process? Because if you're trying to help a country grow enough food on the macro level, you're really dealing with the commercial farming sector. But if you're really trying to improve hunger on the household level, you're really dealing with the subsistence farmers, the smallholders, the farmers that don't necessarily have the resources that the commercial sector would have. And what we've been saying is this is not a zero-sum game, that you basically need to do both, and they're just require different approaches. CRS, by the way, we work with the poor. We work with the poorest of the poor in some cases and just the poor in other cases. And we try to actually help subsistence farmers become better subsistence farmers. We try to help smallholder people who are almost ready to get to the market. We help them get ready for the market so they can actually engage in the actual economic agricultural sector. So the role of iNGOs, we are an international non-governmental organization. Another subset of that is the private voluntary organization or the faith-based organization. So CRS is really in this realm. And one of the things that we have been saying to the administration is that we do have, we've been working on hunger for decades in some of these countries. So we have lots of experience, and we've been working with the local communities and local partners and the people in need. So here's just a list of really ways that we have been saying that we can help. We can help identify the need, and then look at approaches we've tried over the years and learned from, and then looking at really trying to gear up those approaches to really make a much more difference in a national level. And then incorporating these approaches into the governmental programs. I think in Malawi, I was told that their national nutrition policy was actually based on CRS efforts and CRS nutrition guidelines this was a process that happened over many years, but we actually have influenced the national government to actually incorporate our approach to nutrition. So that sort of thing. And of course, then formalizing these partnerships, these national public-private partnerships. These are things that we take for granted in the United States, whereas you will have the United States working with the American Red Cross in disasters, the government. You'll see that food distribution, Catholic Charities has many, many government grants in the United States that they operate with. On and on and on. Whereas in many countries, these types of public-private relationships are very fragile, or they barely exist. So we feel that really one component of the solution is to really develop good, healthy public-private partnerships in these countries, and certainly CRS wants to contribute to that. I don't want you to go through this whole slide, but I just wanted to show you the number of countries and which countries they are in terms of Feed the Future. They're trying to focus on certain countries. There are 20 countries under the Feed the Future initiative. Certain have different emphases. The other columns, FYI, are basically the three columns to the right are dealing with different food aid programs. LRP is local regional purchase. It's a pilot program. And so we were really looking in terms of some of the overlap among the different organizations. Among the different food aid initiatives put out by the U.S. government. And then on the left-hand column is the CADUP. CADUP is Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program. It's actually coming out of the African Union. But what they have done is this entity has really worked with national governments to develop compacts. And so I was just tracking which countries have completed their compact right now. I think that most have already. The ones that outside of Africa, they're really looking at other mechanisms because there's of course, no CADUP in there. This complicated flowchart results framework. I just wanted to show you that on the left-hand side of the top, there's it really is looking at inclusive agricultural growth, and on the right, it's really looking at nutrition. And so those are the two major components of Feed the Future. And of course, then they have different kind of ways of dealing with that, different indicators around that, and all these types of things. So this is the realm that Feed the Future is trying to work with. And of course, we as an organization, we try to encourage them to make sure they haven't left anything out. So here's another, just to state again how we get involved. Some of the things that we do are really doing a lot of coalition building. We work very closely with, for instance, CARE and Save the Children and other kind of World Vision and Mercy Corps and all these other types of large non-governmental organizations. We work very closely with them in a community. We work with other kind of hunger advocates in Washington. Types of advocates that we do, we look at the budget all the time, any kind of budget discussion that comes through in Capitol Hill. We're looking at that, looking at those numbers, and trying to make the case for the numbers that we think are needed. We have different people on staff here who really look at need and also look at historic trends and things like that. And so we really try to have a very kind of informed discussion with policymakers on budget and what that means to the poor and the hungry around the world. And then we spend a lot of time these days on Feed the Future. We look at and we really try to scrutinize how we think that program is rolling out and how it can be improved. Then, of course, the Farm Bill. The food aid is U.S. food aid programs are authorized under the Farm Bill, which is authorized every 5 years or so. So that actually becomes a big piece of work for CRS. And we're gearing up for another one. So thank you very much. I always appreciate entering into a kind of healthy discussions with our college friends across the country. I think that you play a very critical role in this whole effort. Certainly, the more people who really have a understanding of the complexities of these issues, it's only better, because then people can make more informed decisions in terms of, and also can when they want to call up their person on Capitol Hill, they have a kind of a better idea of how things work. I just want to leave you with just a few resources if you're more interested. This isn't there are hunger reports and resources coming out all the time. So these are a little dated, but they're not, in terms of, they might have come out a few years ago, but the issues are exactly the same. They have not improved. So these are some things that I thought was quite interesting. If you looked on the 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth bullet down was actually the Lancet series on maternal and child undernutrition. That's some of you might know it's a medical journal coming out of the UK. And what was interesting was that back in 2008, they came out and said that that this is a crucial issue. They started focusing on this under 2, from the womb to under 2 age group, and talked about how critical it was. And just from that, it got this discussion going on with policymakers in Washington and actually around the world, and as a result has changed the course of discussion and actually activities carried out by country donors and actually implementers like ourselves. So it's amazing that really good research presented well and by well-respected journals can make a huge difference. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, it can make a huge impact. Anyway, thank you very much, and hope to interact with you down the road.